check it literally right now. So it's on. Testing, 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 testing. Can you hear?
It's a 30-second delay because we are live streaming out the Zoom. So even though we just said testing, 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 she'll
There'll
see
be
it.
a half minute.
Absolutely.
Okay, I will.
But she should hear us now though.
Okay. Okay. Great. Hi there. Hi.
Hello,
I'm
I'm
Julia.
Kristen. I'm with Dantrich Aid for one of the
great.
organizations.
And welcome to
in our building. We partner with Gates and with PEP and the government of Barbados very, very often, and we are thrilled that we found a new way to build out this cooperation. So I'll get out of your way because I know you're already pressed for time. Lots to do.
Thank you very much. We have a really full schedule, a really nice agenda, which is a combination of opening remarks, a keynote by the Honourable Prime Minister Motley, who will join us shortly, a panel conversation during which I have the pleasure of asking questions to a number of very esteemed colleagues, followed by a video message, and then a roundtable. And then we'll have closing remarks. So in case it feels like we're going all over the place, it's by design, but we will have a little bit of flexibility as Prime Minister is occupied for the next few minutes, and so the first few minutes may not go entirely in the sequence that was envisioned. We're also waiting for our colleagues from Brazil, so you'll have people coming in and out. My name is Pet Vardeweel. I am the director of the Bridgetown Initiative and Prime Minister Motley's advisor on climate resilience. I've collaborated in different ways with many people around the table, so it's a pleasure to welcome you. I think we will start with some opening remarks from yourself, Vardeweel, and then move on to whoever arrives first. We freestyle here. It can't be too serious.
This is the second time in 2 days that I am the warm-up act for Prime Minister Motley. She did the same thing to me the other night, so I'll just tell jokes until she comes in, and we'll get off to a good start. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. Thank you. This room represents really a 20-plus group coalition that has been working for about a year now to get to the point we're at now. We're super happy to be sharing the results of both sort of research work, but also an agenda going forward on adaptation. On the Gates Foundation side, this has been a year of sort of reflection and action for us. It's our 25th anniversary year as an organization, and also the year we set ourselves a time horizon of 20 years until our own close. And so it's been a year where we're doing a lot of thinking and planning in our organization about how to make the most progress with the tools we have, the innovations, against the challenges that matter most. And it would be hard to not anchor in exactly where we are today, the combination of human development and climate. And for us, adaptation has been that nexus of those two issues, has been a narrative, a framing that we've been committed to for a while, but I think we can all sort of agree it has been hard to action. It's taken a lot of effort to get adaptation on the agenda, if you will. Huge thanks to the Brazilians who have put it front and center in COP. And yet still we owe it to ourselves to make it specific. What do we do if we care about adaptation? Where do we start? It can't be all things to all people. So the hope is that today's report, and huge thanks to Systemiq, helps us set that action agenda. I hope you'll interrogate it, listen, debate, and leave with two things. One, better understanding, better grounding of what the best buys are in adaptation. More importantly, you're all here because you're in the business of action. So I hope you leave with something to do, something to invest in, something to champion, something to take forward on the agenda. Thank you.
So, No jokes. That's okay. You'll get that slightly nervous laughter, but by the middle of this conversation, we'll all be friendly. So I think what we might do in attendance of Ivan from Brazil and Prime Minister is perhaps go to you, Guido. We have about 5 minutes, but feel free to stretch it to about 7 to give and I will cut you off there, to give a presentation, I think, of the main insights from the report, which I think will be very useful. And we encourage everyone to read it. So hopefully this gives enough of a snippet to get us going for the rest of the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Pep, and thanks to the many organizations that are in this room. This has been a big a coalition effort almost. And thanks for the wonderful partnership with the Gates Foundation. So very pleased to present this report here, which we also worked on very intensively with the Brazilian COP presidency. So also huge thanks for their partnership and collaboration. And they, as you all know, are very committed to putting the resilience and the adaptation topic at the center of discussions in Belém. So we salute their leadership. So the report essentially, as a core point, really posits that we need to think of resilience as an investment agenda. This is no longer just a problem to talk about as something that's happening in the distant future. It will, yes, obviously require policy changes, but those need to focus on redirecting existing investment flows to make them resilient. And there are, as I come to, about $350 billion in additional investments in EMDEs and emerging markets that are needed for the resilience agenda. The resilience topic is crucial to make communities safe and prosperous. It is critical for companies to be competitive and to be successful in the marketplace. We're seeing more and more sectors where the physical risks are already significant today. And resilience really is becoming the development narrative. It is obviously also linked to mitigation, as this mitigation remains the most important and the critical long-term measure to ensure resilience. We all know that, and mitigation measures also must be resilient themselves, but we don't focus on that in detail on this report. So why focus on resilience? One of the first questions that we asked ourselves is, well, where is the evidence base on the benefits of investments? And the evidence is there, but it was quite scattered. And so what we've tried to do across these 20+ organizations is to pull it together. These are just some initial insights. There's a lot more in the report, obviously. We're seeing we could avoid 1 or 2 million additional deaths if we invest in resilience. If we don't invest them, that is going to happen quite soon, by 2030. Where resilience, a lack of investments in resilience will push more people into extreme poverty. What is often less understood is we tend to focus on the disasters because they're visible, but it's the slow onset changes, the slow burn changes that often have very, very severe economic costs. A 30 degrees Celsius ambient temperature can reduce productivity in a factory by at least 15%. I mean, the human productivity, which are massive numbers that often add up to economic costs that are greater than those from the disasters. For companies, the losses are large already, and we're seeing for LDCs that the lack of investments in resilience could have at least a 10% GDP impact. So the good news is that we actually can mitigate a lot of these costs. Just to be clear, there is no perfect adaptation. There's no perfect resilience. Climate change and nature loss are going to be net negatives. But we can see that early warning systems, for example, can reduce mortality rates by a factor of 6. There is a very large also investment opportunity for companies at 500 billion to 1.3 trillion by 2030, and we've seen the $35 billion in incremental investments. But one of the most sort of shocking, I think, numbers for me out of this report is that for every single dollar that's invested today in resilient infrastructure, close to $87 to be precise, go into infrastructure that's not resilient, that is not fit for purpose, that is not going to be a good investment in long term. And that gives you an illustration of just the redirection of investment flows that we need to make. If you're looking at insurance as a solution, we know that today that 60% of damages from natural disasters are uninsured globally, and in many developing countries that ratio rises to 90+%. So we really are seeing very, very massive risks here. Gagi has called out briefly as part of this work we've worked with, or BCG has led an assessment of what are some of the best buys. This is based on an assessment of adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions and the various climate strategies that countries have. I am not going to go through them, but as you can see, they cover the full spectrum of social sectors to physical infrastructure, and they are detailed in the report together with the supporting evidence base. To close, this is in terms of next steps. There are three broad areas that we've also aligned on with the COP30 presidency. Number one is we need to deliver on country priorities, and virtually every country now has some national adaptation plan or strategy, but these are not, in most cases, in almost all cases, are not yet investable proposals. So they need to be turned into investable programs with clear KPIs. And we're seeing, with the work that, for example, Uganda, Sam is already leading, we're seeing strong evidence that is not only possible in a short period of time, but it's also likely going to reduce the cost of capital for investments in these programs. There are various country platforms under discussion that can help here tremendously, and they obviously need to have resilience as a core theme. We need to embed resilience into every economic and financial decision in the public and the private sector. We've just had a good discussion on the macroeconomics of that, shared by the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. There's lots of work happening, described in the report, at the corporate level and insurance. Let me call this out as a particularly important sectors. And then there are a number of really important enablers. We need better pricing and data on resilience. We need more clarity on the investment typology, because resilience is not a sector, so we often have, I think this comes from you, that quote, Tali, I attribute it to you. It's not a sector, so often the lack of action is actually driven by something as simple as confusion or lack of understanding what it means to invest in resilience. Again, typology across public and private, and I've already mentioned the risk data. So we want to really, we see COP30 as a major opportunity to put this agenda really at the center of discussions, not to displace the mitigation, but to really give it the attention it deserves. And then Gagi, as you said, is to really make it operational. I think there's some good recommendations, and huge thanks to all the organizations that contributed. And I think that's going to be the agenda for the coming year.
Thank you. On time too. I'm going to be honest, these mics are really weird because I'm not sure you can all hear the rattling, and I also don't know that there's a way around it. So maybe I'll put that there and I don't knock it over. Thanks so much, Guido, and I think those insights are extremely clear. I'm going to go off script a little bit and say that it's now Thursday, it's October, and I can't count the number of conversations that I've been in, and I'm sure all of you who probably travel way more than I do have been in, that are talking about the need for climate action. It's amazing that there is now a sense that resilience is critical and a political agenda behind that. But for many of us, that's been obvious, particularly for those who come from countries that have been hit and are hit again and again. So I'm going to introduce the panel, and I have a few questions. Oh, sorry. Plot twist. So we're going to stand up and walk the panelists. Okay. And then we'll get to the panel. Thank you for joining, Piano.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So we've just done some brief introductions and gone through some insights around resilience, a lot of data that shows the numbers, but I was actually just saying that numbers and presentations and reports aside, for those countries that year after year either face slow onset climate micro crises or large events that pose a real threat to the survival of people and to the economy, the data shows things that we've known qualitatively and know intuitively. And so the question is, how do we use that data? How do we use the political moment of COP30 to actually advance the agenda in a way that makes sense for leaders such as yourself, Prime Minister, and the leaders of many other countries that are represented around this table, so that we take this from a conversation which feels intellectually satisfying and that actually provides the numbers. So we all need to substantiate investment, but then takes us across the line to actually doing some doing. And so perhaps with that, Prime Minister, if you have found your feet and are happy to take the floor, I'll pass to you.
I would have rather hear you speak
Okay.
first, but
So-
I'll go. Let me apologize. We actually have a lot happening in the Caribbean at the moment, and there's actually a heads of government meeting going on and some other things that we're dealing with. So I'm truly sorry to be distracted. The bottom line is that both yesterday afternoon and this morning, in the sessions that I did, we spoke to the need for those who are willing to move and those who have options to understand that they actually have options rather being paralyzed by the fear of what others may say or do and being paralyzed by the reality of a world that has changed so much in the last few years. And what do I mean by that? If there were no advances, you could almost justify doing nothing. But we have seen some movement. We've seen movement on the climate disaster resilient clauses, which I really don't like the name. I call it the natural disaster clauses, which is what we've called it. And when all is said and done, there is no country or entity that is going to give Barbados the equivalent of 17-18% of GDP in a 2-year period after a major climatic event. So unless someone has another idea, this one unlocks actually the largest amount of liquidity for us at a time when the numbers of persons and companies that are uninsured and underinsured is rising because of the lack of access in some instances and the lack of affordability in other instances of insurance premium. The bottom line is that we have seen progress with the Resilience and Sustainability Fund, and even though the word climate is a bad word for some, there's a Calypsonian in the Caribbean called the Mighty Sparrow, who had a song that basically said, don't believe a lying word that your eyes are telling you. And that is what others are asking us to believe about climate, that it is happening, but it is all lies, so don't believe that that's happening. And to that extent, therefore, we continue to recognize that the work of building resilience is at the core of everything that we do. But resilience isn't a new word, nor is resilience a word related to climate. And the irony is that Barbados' next debt swap is actually a debt swap for social resilience and not climate resilience. And one of the points that both the Bridgetown Initiative and the 4Ps made clear from the beginning is that you cannot separate people and planet. It's a false dichotomy. And therefore, if that is the case, then resilience for human beings must mean resilience. And to that extent, if I have to say so, we have been since emancipation in the middle 1838 in the 19th century, have had to exhibit resilience in order simply to survive. So that when I look at the situation, the people who perhaps are feeling the most off balance are the larger countries and the larger institutions, because this is not what you're accustomed to. But regrettably, this has been our reality for a very, 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 very long time. So I start from this point because we have learned to claim success and reset and go again. And I suspect that that is what the international community is going to have to learn to do, rather than believing that all things are lost. Secondly, I believe that countries have to show more commitment at the domestic level, and that is why Bridgetown 2.0 had spoken about mobilization of domestic resources as part and parcel of the equation. And we took a clear decision that you cannot talk the talk without walking the walk, and we have established a resilience and regeneration fund, as some of you have heard already, that requires 0.25 of 1% of earnings to go into the fund from every employee and every self-employed person, and the employers will match the contributions of the employees, and the government itself will put 0.35% of GDP every year before we put anything else on the table, recognizing that this is a mechanism by which we, one, keep faith with our citizenry, but two, also have more moral authority to speak to those outside of our borders about an issue that we are trying to fix, not because we caused it, but because it is our reality. Thirdly, we need to recognize that whether we like it or not, there's still too many biases in the international community, and anything that is not reflected in a traditional North Atlantic prism, I didn't say prison, but prism, is casted with doubt and suspicion. And we pay a heavy price for the fact that this is the reality of what it is to be a former colony. And this is the reality of how we continue to be viewed. But rather than lamenting it alone, we need to confront it and deconstruct it, and to be able to see where truly are the information gaps that would cause people to want to cost us out of the park in ways that are unacceptable. Fourthly, we need to be able to have political will return to the table. It was there. All of a sudden, you can use SDRs to assist Argentina. All of a sudden, when quantitative easing was a bad word during the pandemic, the G7 countries did quantitative easing in the trillions, while you left $80 billion for 80 something countries to share in to be able to get through the pandemic. I am saying that it is the absence of clear political will that is stopping the real progress. But you have to accept that it is still possible for us to become strategic rather than trying to take a scattershot approach to everything. And that is why I strongly support the Global Methane Agreement, because I genuinely believe that it meets the love language of those who don't want to admit that there is something called a climate crisis, and it meets the love language of those who fervently believe that we are facing an existential crisis. And those examples are as old as humanity itself, that very often in the most unlikely of places, you can find common purpose and potentially a win-win for everyone. The scientists are the ones who are advising. I don't profess to be a scientist, but they have said very clearly, you can reverse temperatures by 0.5 degree if we get the methane issue controlled. We have the technology to genuinely be able to determine where methane exists and where it doesn't, so that we are capable of proving it with relative certainty. We are in a position where if we can get companies, oil and gas companies, to agree that flaring gas is burning money and not fixing pipes is losing money, then their balance sheets improve. But more importantly, you need them at the same time to receive an instruction that if you really want to drill, baby, drill, then you perhaps need to move with warp speed, as you did with vaccines, on settling how you're going to scale up decarbonizing technology to a commercial scale. In my UN speech, I made it clear the fossil fuel industry is not the enemy, it is emissions. And therefore, we need to find, right now, we are sitting in a square and there's a common space in there. We need to find the common space with the oil and gas companies to be able to allow us to at least stem the flow and bring us back to a point of reversal of half a degree. And at the same time, when you use decarbonizing technology, the scientists show that you immediately have a spike in temperatures, but it comes back down. So you need an offsetting mechanism, and potentially control of the methane can be that offsetting mechanism. There's a little more complexity with respect to livestock and rice paddy farming because the farmers don't have the balance sheets to carry the adjustment in the way that the oil and gas companies do. But I believe through some form of subsidy and thinking creatively, we can find a way to help them change how they farm, not stop them from farming. I say these things because if we can domestically, regionally, and then selectively, strategically with those countries that have the political will, while praying that the others will soon be persuaded again, because the one sure thing is that the temperatures are still there rising and that the climate crises will still come. And hopefully, populations will become less tolerant of persons who tell them not to believe a word their lying eyes are showing them. We have the ability to make progress. Will it be at the speed of Usain Bolt? No, it will not be. But can progress be made nevertheless by those who are willing to roll up their sleeves and to share the burden and to share in the responsibility of finding partners? Yes, I believe we can. And fundamentally, Bridgetown 3.0 tries to pull away. I don't even want to call it a number anymore, but what it tries to do is to find where there is common ground and where we are likely to be able to make some progress going forward. Because the most important thing is not just to keep hope alive, but also to show that there is progress, even if not in miles, in yards, even if not in kilometers, in meters, even if not as we would like it, sufficient to be able to bring the others who are not yet in the battle on board with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, firstly for joining us, because we understand it is an extremely tense time, and so we appreciate your time, and please, of course, feel free to depart it at any moment. Perhaps I'll go back to the schedule, because now we have Ivan as well. Thank you. Welcome, Ivan. Ivan Oliveira is with the Ministry of Finance of Brazil and a core member of the COP30 presidency team. Ivan, please, a few words from you.
Thanks, Pep. I'm sorry for being late. In fact, I went to another place and then had to take a car, but I could listen in the YouTube Guido's presentation in the beginning of Mia's presentation too. So a real pleasure to be with you. Let me just reinforce how timely the report is, it's really the kind of joint push that we need to do together. Just yesterday we had the launch of the report of the Circle of Finance Ministers of COP30 that should be well embedded in the roadmap from Baku to Berlin. That should be out later this month. And there we can see something, probably I think Pep touched on that briefly at the beginning of the meeting, how we have been trying to bring, in all the 5 pillars of the report, you find adaptation and resilience. When we talk about MDBs, funds, concessional, private sector mobilization. So it's really trying to reinforce the message that we need to go beyond mitigation. That's the easiest part, especially when it comes to the private sector, but really go for resilience and adaptation. in very concrete terms, I'd say, and that's the call from the report. I had a good interaction yesterday, for example, on the report, and somebody said, "Oh, you know, doing the report is easy. We need to go for implementation." And then I said, "Look, this is a different story, because at the end of the day, the report itself is based on implementation. We're not reinventing the wheel with the report. We're essentially taking Bridgetown Initiative points, G20 roadmaps and reforms of the funds and multilateral banks, the agenda on country platforms, and we're really, you know, under the framework of COP, with the lens of climate finance, we're saying, look, there are a couple of priorities we can have when it comes to the recommendations that are there. And from the Minister of Finance, we'd like to push this way. So it's really about the implementation that's on its way. I think we've seen, you know, including when it comes to the multilateral climate funds, a lot of work has been done. We start to see those things getting to the ground. If you take the Brazilian country platform, for example, the way we launched it, it's a very, you know, unique endeavor where somehow we started to see the system moving and helping us in framing our own platform. So it's really a report about implementation. And from this COP to the next one, what we'd like to do from Brazil, taking the presidency that's just about to start, in fact, is really to continue to push together with you and many other players, you know, in different fora, using Bridgetown Initiative, reinforcing the message, but going for, you know, the specific changes we need to make on MDBs, the funds, the private sector. We've been engaging a lot with the private sector this year to build out the report, and it's interesting to see, for example, the US is not represented in the circle. Maybe it will not be represented there by a public official in Belém, but the private sector of the US is really, you know, connected, and we've been listening to, you know, very critical players in the market here, and they'll be in Belém also and willing to push ahead. So there's a lot of hope. Prime Minister Samia, I think your leadership has been absolutely important in this sense. We're really happy to join forces with you in this process. Count with Brazil, count with COP30. We're in a process of implementation. The report is part of the implementation process. Let's continue that, and let's get, you know, to the next COP with some very concrete results, money on the ground according to the country's priorities, from the funds, the banks better engaging them, private sector and new structures being launched according, again, to the needs of the countries that are quite different at the end of the day. And just to finish with a take that has a lot more to do with our own agenda from the Minister of Finance, our domestic agendas, that is also how we, from Ministers of Finance, we're going to deal with the fine-tuning of economic instruments to deal with resilience, you know, so that we get the right incentives to the stakeholders domestically, but also the international ones that are coming to our markets. Because in a country like Brazil, we are a federation, quite big and diverse country with quite different fiscal structures. And so when we have a problem in the south of Brazil with Rio Grande do Sul, for example, the flooding that we had there, the National Treasury had to come and save a country that was already in very bad fiscal conditions. So essentially, the federation came and saved a state of the federation. The Minister Haddad likes to say that if the floods were just 200 kilometers down to the south, a whole country, Uruguay, would be underwater, and there would be no federation to save it. So that's the kind of call that I think really unites us and really connects quite straightforward the domestic agenda to the international agenda, and really keen to keep going and pushing together with you. And pleasure to be here, and good to see the results of the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivan. So, with that said, I think it's become very clear that we have country perspectives that are very real, that are very challenging from day to day. There are some countries that have a federation, and there are others that don't. You talk of Uruguay, but we have many much smaller countries that literally live on a knife's edge. So with that, I think we'll go to our panel, and they need no introduction, but I will introduce them nevertheless. I'm joined by Lord Nick Stern from the London School of Economics. There's Annie Annie Dasgupta, who is the president of the World Resources Institute, Stefan Hallegaert, chief economist, chief climate economist at the World Bank. We already met Guido Schmidt-Traub, who actually I forgot to introduce as a partner at Systemiq, and Tarier Badegesin, CEO of the Climate Investment Funds. So, a few questions to you, both based on the report and otherwise. Nick, if I may.
Yes.
You have an upcoming report from the Grantham Research Institute, which fed into the launch of the report, the report that was launched today. You've looked at the cost of inaction. You've looked at the economic case for investing. What does your work show, and how do you take what it shows to action?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a privilege to be here with Prime Minister Mia and all the people on this panel. I can't run through them all, obviously, but it's a very special group, and thank you for including me in that group. And congratulations to Ivan to the way in which you guys have been doing COP30. You know, we salute what you've done, and the Circle was a tremendous achievement, both putting it together and the report itself. And this report here, I think, is a tremendous contribution. It gives us a clear narrative based on evidence, and it gives us an action agenda. But to try to respond to the language of the question, 20 years ago when we did the Stern Review, we argued that the cost of action was far less than the cost of inaction. We've gone beyond that now and said, well, it's clear we have to act. Certainly around mitigation, that argument is past. The question then becomes, given that inaction is catastrophic, what do you actually do? And then you go straight to investment. You have to invest, and in different ways. You have to invest in infrastructure, you have to innovate, you have to do things in different ways. And then when you look at it that way, you see that this is a tremendous growth story. This is not sacrificing something to look after the climate. It's using climate action to drive a much better form of development than the dirty, destructive models of the past. It's not just if you're clever, you can balance it. It's stronger than that. It's that the investments involved in climate action drive a new form of growth. Infrastructure, of course, a big part, but much more than that. I think we've now passed that point for adaptation. It's absolutely clear, and this is what the report shows very strongly, that the costs of inaction around adaptation are far bigger than the cost of action. And that's just another way of saying that if you look at action, it's got a tremendous rate of return. And those rates of return are documented in a specific way. So I think we've got to the point where saying, well, we really have to do it and we have to invest a little later on adaptation. But it's crystal clear. And so the discussion is now, how do you invest in a way that makes your economies much more resilient? How do you create the conditions for that investment? So first identify the investment, create the conditions for investment, and finance the investment. You're going to need all kinds of insurance and financial structures within all that. But it's about investing in order to be much more resilient. We've got, and here the independent high-level expert group, Amar here and Vera Songway, I hope you all know Vera, we've been sharing that. And we come up with a number, and it's based, it's reflected very much, or whichever one's reflected in the other, it's consistent with the kinds of numbers in the report. We're talking about, by 2035, about 400 billion, and now we're running at about 40 or 50. So that's 8 to 10 times we have to scale up. But these are very attractive investments. So it's not a question of whether, it's a question of how we actually make it happen. The areas of investment are all set out, and Guido didn't run through them, but we're talking about agriculture and water, we're talking about resilient infrastructure, coastal protection, disaster risk management, and the warning systems, which Guido mentioned, nature-based solutions, managing heat and health responses, and so on. And of course, as Guido emphasised, it's not just shocks, it is that whole slow onset story along with it. And let me finally go to the finance point, because identify the investments, create the conditions for investments, but financing adaptation is more difficult than financing mitigation. I'm not saying that all mitigation finance is that easy, but adaptation is more difficult because in many cases the returns to your investment are spread across a lot of people. So how do you actually get the returns? I mean, if you make your own house earthquake proof, then you get the returns of that investment. But a lot of the stuff, particularly around water management and so on, the investment is made with flood control or whatever it is, and it's spread across the community. So one form of finance will be to strengthen local public finance systems so that the city or the township or whatever it is has a means to raise the resources out of the extra incomes that come from the adaptation action. At the individual level, information, if you tell people what the risks of flooding are, they're much more likely to make the investments that they can make in their own properties, of course, in the context of the bigger investments that the community makes. So first, local public finance. Second, information itself. Regulation is very important. You may have noticed what catastrophe we've created in the UK with the way in which we privatised and regulated the water industry. There are lots of examples in the UK about how not to do things, and people ought to study it. It seems to me quite closely. We showed how not to close coal mines. Yeah, we showed how not to privatise the water industry. Really, a lot of educational stuff there. But the problem was when they privatised the water industry, they said, "Oh, it's a monopoly, and first-year economics, monopolists can price gouge, so you have to control the price." That's not wrong. But there are other things that go on in water, like contamination, like pumping sewage into rivers. So that regulation would have created a better form of regulation, would have created more investment, and of course the consumers ultimately would pay. But you can spread that out if you do the finance right over a long, big area. So local finance, information, regulation, and finally, and it's my final point, but it's a very important one. All about bringing private sector finance in, if you can, is don't overdo the distinction between mitigation and adaptation. An awful lot of what we do is development, mitigation, adaptation, all wrapped up together. Mangroves, restoring degraded land, public transport, decentralised solar. So much of what we do is all three wrapped up together. And just take decentralised solar. There's a wonderful firm called Selco operating out of Bangalore, which you've been acquainted with for a while. They do microfinance for small-scale solar. That makes people much more resilient. If the power cracks up, that you've got your own thing to keep you going. It increases incomes. There are lots of gender opportunities that it creates in terms of charging up people's cell phones and all sorts of running a local shop, all sorts of ways. So we mustn't set mitigation against adaptation because so much of what we do is mitigation, adaptation wrapped up together. And it also helps the finance story where that's true. And I just gave one small example. So I think we're actually in a much more cheerful position than we used to be, in the sense that the degree of understanding, the specificity, what we have to do is all developing. And so I think we've shown the opportunity now, the challenge, and Prime Minister Mir put it very clearly. If you understand what to do, then do it.
Thank you. And I think these are extremely strong points. I'd like to take the liberty of having Prime Minister here maybe for another few seconds to point that as Barbados's investment plan for prosperity and resilience, which does not say climate adaptation, it does not say climate plan, it's prosperity and resilience, is very clear that the points that Guido spoke about earlier, I think in Barbados said strong communities, robust economy, environmental sustainability and climate resilience on top of all of that. So you're absolutely right, Nick, that they go together. Likewise, the points of what you build, how you build, where you build, right? That's core. It's around regulations, around planning. If you need to move people, fine, but let's avoid them going to the places that are going to flood in the first place if you have that luxury. But I do think
it's the poorest people who end up in the floodplains. Right?
Of course, and it's the poorest people who are not resilient before the crisis and are even worse off after, right? But I do think that there are some nuances I'd like to dig into, particularly with Stefan. So you talk about subnationals. Small countries don't have subnationals, and many countries that have municipalities don't have well-functioning municipalities, and so devolving the borrowing to the subnational level doesn't always work because there is only one government, in the case of Barbados, for example, and the government, again, sorry, Prime Minister, if I may, is dealing with a whole bunch of things. To give you an example, Stefan, of mains replacement, because you've written so much around infrastructure. 40 to 60% water losses. So it's an issue of too much water, too little water. In a country that's water starved, how do you deal with mains replacement over 2,500 kilometers of mains that have to be replaced over time? And in some instances, you don't know where they are because they were laid 100 years ago during the colonial era. So these are very practical things we have to deal with. So question for you, because we met at a time when I was working in Dominica and you were working on Fiji, actually. So I think we have that island perspective. How do you see the opportunity to leverage this resilience agenda, not to address climate, but to transform particularly small economies? Nick, you spoke about agriculture. I'm thinking about sugar in Fiji. How do we move this from a problem that we have to solve to a mindset to shift the work that institutions like the bank is doing on small states to be way more ambitious and actually way more impactful?
Thank you so much, and it's really impressive to be discussing those issues in a room like here, and to have your voice pushing those issues. It's really a big change compared with just a few years ago. I try to be even more positive than Nick, which is always a challenge. And I was really happy to see that the report is really not defensive, because to me that's really what we shouldn't do. Like, approach those issues in a defensive manner. Like, we'll try to reduce losses, we'll try to avoid some of the suffering. And the report, I think, is doing a great job as pushing a positive discussion. But I would like to push you even more, if I may, because when we're talking about development, about structural change, about growth, what we're asking firms and people to do is to take risks. We want people to educate themselves. We want farmers to change the way they grow rice. We want firms to try new business models. How can you do that if you're dealing with exogenous shocks all the time? If you have power outages every time there is a high temperature, or flood every time it rains too much? People cannot manage risks individually. They have to manage all of the risks that they are exposed to. And so when we remove external risks like climate and disaster risks, we're making it easier for people and firms to take the good risks. Yeah. And so I think that, to me, the right framing is we have to take care of the bad risks so that people can take the good risks, the one that they benefit from. And that's a little bit this idea behind this triple dividends that we see Carter here, that we've been pushing for a long time, to say this is not about just reducing risks, right? It's about what risks you're doing and how you benefit from them. The second point I wanted to make is we're maybe doing the other way around, looking at these issues at the World Bank now, mostly at the country level. And that's what we're trying to do with our country climate and development reports. We'll have more than 90 countries covered by the next few weeks. And I think the idea is really to take it country per country, to put the numbers that we see on those slides at the country level. And so, Pep, you were mentioning the situation of small islands. What's really striking when we started this work is to see how many reports exist on India and Brazil and China. But then you go to African countries and you realize, wow, we're the first one looking at development from a climate angle and a resilience angle. And I think some of the numbers we see are scary, with billions and trillions. It gets a little bit more manageable when you get it country per country and you realize some of those needs are very concentrated, and there are a lot of things we can do in some countries, in some sectors, with numbers that we can get started with. And I'll keep going, trying to make it look easier. At the end, hopefully everybody will think that this is a walk in the park. Because I think when we talk about, especially the private sector angle, I find the discussion very, very confused, because there are so many things that we want to do. So what I find useful, and that we have done quite a lot in CCDRs, is to have three buckets. Right? There is one bucket which is the incremental costs for everything we're doing. So every time we're building a house, a factory, a road. Good news for that, it's not very expensive. It's like you increase the cost by like 3-5% maybe. Other good news, it's very private sector oriented, and investors have already an incentive to do it. And so for those amounts, and they are big amounts, even it's few percent, but it's out of a big denominator, to do that, we can build on the incentives that exist already, and we can look at the barriers. And so Nick mentioned the data, it's a big problem, and the public sector needs to invest in that. The regulations, the lack of financial inclusion, CGAP has been looking at that quite a lot, that just bringing people saving and borrowing opportunities, they can do things that they want to do to become more resilient. And of course, the standards and the construction norms, maybe the most the least sexy topic in the world that I'm absolutely passionate about. If we could invest in all countries to have the right, especially explicit construction standards for infrastructure and buildings, everything would look very different. So we have this first bucket. It's about obstacles, and the private sector is ready to go. We did a review recently. There are zillions of examples of companies doing it already. The second bucket is for projects that have resilience as their main objectives. And here, it's much more complicated. There are exceptions, like electricity generation, the private sector is happy to step in. But for a lot of things like health, water, sanitation, flood management, it's a public goods. The private sector won't go. And so we're back to a second bucket of solutions, domestic resource mobilization, of course, public-private partnerships, and also innovation like land value capture, which I don't think was mentioned. So I think that's something that we can really push to try to generate a flow of revenues that we can use to build financial solutions. And the last bucket is when, in spite of everything we have done, something bad happened. We need post-disaster finance. Here, I think we have made enormous progress. Some have been mentioned already. There are needs for people, and that's adaptive social protection, that's financial inclusion, that's insurance. And a lot of that is transferring risks to the government, so we need the sovereign to also be protected. And this is something where I think we should flag the progress that has been made and build on it. So I don't want to be longer than that, but I think behind the big numbers in the trillions, there are a lot of smaller things, and a lot of them, if we open the box, are not as complicated as they might look. So maybe I'll try something new. I'll disagree with Nick. You said it's much more complicated than for mitigation. I think it's much easier, but it's much more granular. It's really like a lot of solutions. And so what we need is this type of discussion where we have a lot of people around the room, because it won't be one actor doing it. It's really about the awareness and all of the actors doing what they can.
Thank you. So I'm glad that we have cheerful people on the left, and I'm glad that you decided to disagree with Nick's there.
I think that's difficult rather than complicated.
No, but I think I think you're right, and I think that, and Prime Minister said this earlier, I think we do need to recognize and replicate the examples of things that have worked. So if you look at debt pause clauses or natural disaster clauses, right, when we started this conversation with the World Bank, there was a sense that, well, you're not going to get what you want now, but maybe in 2 years after the next board meeting, but like you can inch your way. And we did get what we wanted actually after 3 months. And I think that has served.
Thanks to President Banga.
Thanks to President Banga, absolutely.
And in fairness, there were 2 iterations before we got it right.
Correct.
And on each one, when they did it and we said it wasn't working for us, the World Bank went back and changed it to modify it. So, I mean, if we can get countries now to do that, and I'm also working on trying to get a select group of development funds to look at providing 30 and 40-year loans for education, health, and water. If we can do those simple things, even in this age of great uncertainty, then we will make significant progress where progress was not made before. So that, with the Global Methane Agreement, to my mind, is where I want to spend my energy. If I try to spread it out too thin, then we achieve nothing.
I think the low-cost, long-term capital is absolutely critical.
It's a game changer.
So, yeah.
And I've tried to set it, even this week, with those who will listen, as a paradigm change. Because the market is so focused on short-term debt that tell me, how the hell does a primary school child who goes into a new primary school that you have built and you're paying back for that 10, 12 years time, the child is not even finished secondary school, the child is not even gone to university yet, and you're being forced to compress the repayment of that asset in that short period of time. So we need to come back to a dose of reality and let the systems work in the same way that we understood that Germany needed at the end of World War II to cap their debt service to a percentage of their exports. In the same way that the UK needed when they converted the 1914 and 1917 bonds into effectively a perpetual bond that was only repaid in 2014. It is not unusual. This is what we have been doing. It's just that it has been for a few rather than for the many.
That's right. No, absolutely, and I think that puts a very fine point on it. And maybe with the focus on finance, Terry, if I could turn to you. So SIF has done some really. I try not to use the word innovative. I find it a little overstated, but you have done some really bold work that has unlocked capital in ways that I think many would have not have thought was possible. Certainly not from an institution or an entity embedded within the World Bank. Like, what is it that you're doing going to the markets in this way? Let's say, I mean, I call it what it is. I think it's incredibly creative. So what's next, and how do you replicate what SIF has done so that the type of financing that we're all seeing is needed can be shown to come to the table at much greater scale, so we don't continue to question whether it's there?
Sure. Okay, is the mic?
It is. It's everywhere.
Okay, okay. Sorry. No, wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, congratulations on the excellent report. It's a great lens for us to go into the new era and the shift in the conversation that's underpinned by data and the positioning resilience of an investment. And thank you for the opportunity for the SIF to contribute to it. And for those of you who don't know the SIF, we are a $13 billion multilateral climate fund. And we're one of the largest providers of concessional finance that very 20 to 40 year long-term concessional loans at your typical IDA rates. So you're talking 70 basis points, 130 basis points all in, with long-term moratoriums, and increasingly doing high-risk instruments like first loss guarantees, junior debt, and junior positionings as a way to catalyze and mobilize private capital and broad private capital. So we have mobilization ratios of 1 to 10 and 1 to 12 across the range. And what Pep was talking about was that last year we became the first multilateral climate fund to go to the capital markets, where we issued a bond program, and we now have a sustainable financing frame building off climate assets. Issued our first bond, it was 6 times oversubscribed. And we're moving forward into using that balance sheet to crowd in additional funding for higher risk instruments that can really be focused on private capital mobilization. And we're increasingly seeking to use those learnings into the other side of our work, which is around resilience and nature. And so many folks don't realize that the SIF has been investing in nature and resilience for many years. We sit at the nexus of climate and economic development. And we've had a very successful resilience program, which we shared our learnings into the production of the report. And this program was established in 2008 when resilience wasn't necessarily a thing. And the idea was to create a pilot program where the multilateral development banks could explore resilience, working with countries. And even from that point on till now, countries identified many of the archetypes that are established in the report. Core being smart agriculture, resilient infrastructure, water stewardship, early warning systems, and insurance. And we have several examples of successes. We've fully deployed the program, over $1 billion. We've surpassed all the targets that were set out, and we have all the data representing that. And we have concluded the evaluation for the study. The evaluation is going to be made public, including the data that can be used into this new era of resilience investments. And the key takeaways from the evaluation that are feeding into our new resilience, second generation resilience programming is a few-fold. One is that the most successful sustainable interventions in resilience in countries, when they were country-led, involved the coordination of line ministries anchored by ministries of finance and economic planning. And the reason, I think, is very much tied to this idea of return on investment. Because even ministries of finance have to see a pathway to that return that would tie either to their continuous budgeting, tie to productive growth in those economies that can underpin those investments. And so the most successful of our programs did that. It improved livelihoods, it led to whole-scale systemic productivity growth as well as resilience. And so our future programming is going to be tying this NAP type planning into investable policy and asset interventions, but in partnership with ministries of finance to embed resilience into their economic planning, and that's a big takeaway. In addition, while we are told we need to move from pilots to scale, right? So we're coming out of piloting and testing resilience to need to scaling capital to resilience, and that is where we're going with our second programming. The next era is private investments in resilience, and how do we scale private capital and private sector solutions and resilience to be able to meet these numbers. And so while our core program is going to build on the successes and the track record and the examples from our first program, especially making the investment case for those economic planning ministries as well as countries to be able to allocate their tax base or their domestic capital alongside grants and concessional funding, we need to figure out the next frontier, which is the private sector. And so we're working toward a learning lab, working with our MDBs to look at what that next phase is so that we're continuously pushing the envelope. The role of blended finance, lots of discussions about the role of grants mapped with blended finance and concessional to solve for many of these issues. So we're very excited about the path forward. We also see positivity, some recent announcements from donors contributing to the program that was held this week. And it's definitely the time through the COP Circle of Finance Ministers, the Coalition for Finance Ministers for Climate, resilience is staying at the top of the agenda. Our one concern has been, our major concern has been, every time we start with these dialogues, resilience starts at the top and it ends up at number 10 or number 11 as the priority. But through these types of forums, with the good work of the Bridgetown Initiative, our hope and expectation is through to Belém, this will remain number 1, number 2 on the agenda, such that we can have this shift that we've all needed from investment to return and to stability.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that link to ministries of finance can't be overstated. The Prime Minister is also Minister of Finance, and I think anyone will tell you if it's not in the budget, and if it's not in the long-term budget, it's not going to happen. So I think, Yvonne, and I'm under pressure to get my time management under control, but I was just going to say that, Yvonne, the COP presidency has said multiple times that it doesn't end at Belém, right? And I think that staying the course for the year plus after Belém is critical, otherwise we do lose that traction. Everything is a moment, but the reality is we need to keep the agenda going. So maybe, Annie, I could turn to you a couple of minutes and talk about what's often identified as the bottleneck or a key bottleneck, which is pipeline. We don't have the pipeline. We don't, and this ties into your point, Terry, right, on how do you get the private sector in? Well, the business models aren't there, so we don't really know how to bring them in. How do you, particularly leveraging the skills and the expertise of WRI, think about the pipeline challenge? And are there specific areas, recognizing that resilience is not a sector, but there's specific areas or themes which you see as low-hanging fruits that we really need to grab and start working on post-haste?
Thanks. I think this is a fantastic group of people here to think about this together. And I also want to say I've been very encouraged this week how much of adaptation and resilience has been part of conversations regularly. So we are very encouraged, Ivan, when we get to Belém, that we're in a good place. I do want to build on, I don't think actually Nick says positive things very often. So it's a good thing that he was happy. I just want to build on one happiness that Nick pointed out. I do think Nick is absolutely right. That at this moment, if you just look at where we are in a much better place analytically and narratively on adaptation resilience than we were just a few years back. That is a very important thing. I mean, not only this report, I think Gargi is left. Gargi gets a lot of credit for bringing us together for this report on focusing on investability on these topics and as a detail, and we were very happy to collaborate with you on this. But before that, we did and Nick's team and Nick himself has been doing a lot of work of cost of inaction. What will happen if we don't do something about it? But before that, we did a piece of work that Carter led, was sitting right there. We asked a very different question, that not about loss. If you invest in it, what will happen to, say, growth? What will happen to development? What will happen to macroeconomic planning? And we found that all these three areas, which is this triple dividend paper, this is actually positively correlated. In some countries, massively positively correlated. So you will say, oh, this analytics and narratives don't really matter. It actually does matter, because Ivan's leadership on this report that Ivan yesterday launched it, right, on the circles of ministers, it is very easily was actually part of the report, because this analytics was done before. And you will see when you see this report how much adaptation finance. So I just want to say we're in a different place in this. But then the question is, great that we have good place, that how do we actually finance it? And that's what I want to talk about in a minute. And if you look at any of the number, Nick just mentioned the number, none of the, because everyone's adaptation, oh, the MDBs will do it. If not,
the foundations will do it. If you just look at the numbers, these two things don't add up to what the gap is. Just don't, like by far. Foundation investments last year on adaptation was $1 billion, $1 billion. So the question is private capital. You talked about it. That's the next frontier. I personally think private capital is a really good. That's not the only thing that needs to happen. It's a really good leading indicator of what needs to happen. So I think we should take focus. Unfortunately, though, making things actually financed is the same hard work that we have to do for anything being financed. Just it's not some because they're the same job of having a strategy, making an investment plan, making the investment being they raising the profile of it in national governments that these are actually allocated. Most governments don't actually get allocate, maximize domestic. These are all common things with mitigation plan. So I just want to point out that there is no silver bullet to actually financing things. The hard work that needs to be done for every project, which is very similar hard. Only good thing is now we have a much better rationale and narrative. I also very much agree with Stefan's point. It's not just one entity needs to do differently. I'll finish in 1 minute. I just want to point out the kind of things we are doing is as an example of all the different things. For example, Brazil is reading country platforms. Many countries have shown we want to make sure this is very much central to country platform discussion about what countries want to do and how we finance it. We actually work with Nick's team with coalition finance ministers to bring adaptation in the central discussion, which wasn't the case for a while, right? And it's still, I don't think it's much better. We run a program to train people in grad school called RAMP to go to Ministry of Finance so they can do macroeconomic planning on adaptation. And we actually part of the African Development Bank, a massive program of land restoration in Africa, where 55% of land is degraded, so which is a direct connection to that. I just want to end by saying that the next step is all of us, to Stefan said this, all of us need to bring this ecosystem to make adaptation financing more conducive. I don't think there is a silver bullet just because we have a good narrative.
For sure. Thank you so much, Andy. So I am going to switch the order around, and this is actually a good point to jump into a roundtable, seamlessly flowing into the Ministry of Finance. Sam, we had a session earlier today, and where I was flanked by two colleagues from the IMF, and never thought that we'd be in a conversation where we were talking about the DSA and the need to incorporate nature and climate in its positive effects on growth, and that everyone in the room was in agreement that this made sense. Could you provide us, and we're going to do a quick fire, could you provide us, in about 2 minutes, with your thoughts, particularly from Minister of Finance perspective, on national accounts, and I'll get quite specific actually, on how you have addressed this practically in your ministry on the ground?
Thank you very much. Today, this afternoon, really had very good things from some from Uganda, Minister of Finance, but I simply going to co-chair of the Coalition of Finance Ministers of Climate Action. So it's really speaks for me. And I'll come to your question. I'll use the 2 minutes, maybe 0.5. But resilience and adaptation is very key. And it has the report, it's implementing the report that came out yesterday, Circle Finance Ministers, really at our hardest, the coalition and government's Minister of Finance. One way that I look at it more is you're talking at macro level, macroeconomic objectives, but there's the micro level also where industries, cost of production, how to bring in country, investors, both local and external, but also at community level, household level, and individual level. And that's when His Excellency, when she said social resilience is key, for me, I felt, this is something we should be able to look at as Minister of Finance. And all this to bring in, public sector government must invest in enablers to crowd in private sector to bring money, to make sure that what we're talking about this afternoon about DSA and how the narrative to bring in resilience and adaptation in our tools and the reports so that the ratings are show that there's a positive investing in adaptation and resilience is to be able to bring in money so that we can be able to invest both domestic and external. And I'll bring you from the global stage as a coalition leader. We're looking at this. We basically we don't want to understand, and we've tried to understand this, and the understanding is already there, but we need more. What are the benefits of investing in resilience and adaptation? Just to have the modeling aspect of that, but also to be able to align these plans that we're talking about, the reports, to national development planning frameworks and budgets, which is key, and then so that we can be able to get the climate financing and be able to implement. Now, coming directly to your question, what we've done in Uganda first is basically was to understand the benefits, and we've put these in our macroeconomic models. We've extended our social accounting matrix to put in the land matrix, the water matrix, and the energy matrix, and so that you can be able to run simulations, and this can tell us that this can happen. So trying to simulate and see what can happen at country level, and we see the advantages of investing in adaptation and resilience. We've also, we've gone back to look at our natural capital accounting. We've done the accounts. We've looked at the last report of the monetary services account 2023. It tells us what we've lost and what we're gained, and if you invest in resilience, what we may gain afterwards. So these are key. But it's a question, and these are practical examples I'll give you also. We invested in a road which is resilient, Entebbe Kampala Express Highway, and it really changed the movement in terms of time. It increased, for example, where I live, 13 kilometers, sometimes during jam hours I take an hour, but driving from Kampala to Entebbe, which is about 40 kilometers now, you take 15 minutes and you are driving very fast. But it's one.
It's really fast.
Yeah, very fast. Yeah,
120 kilometers.
Oh, 20 years. But the point I'm making is that it's really changed how it can go. But it's one of the most expensive roads in Africa, and it costed us a lot. Now, the way it started by telling you micro household, the question was, would you have invested in at some level to make sure they're protected, to make sure so that decision was very, very hard. But over time, when we've seen floods taking our roads, floods blocking things, people have started saying, yes, this was a good investment. That's on the positive side. But the other side, last 2 years ago, we had floods in Kampala, and roads were washed away. And we're now thinking short term, long term. We have little money. So shields, you can see that these are not resistance roads. So the question is about money and how to take the decision at some point. And that's why I felt when the Excellency was talking, I was, there can't be financing, and we can think of it this way, and hearing from everybody here of being encouraged. But there's something we're doing, and we can do it better at country level, especially when ministers of finance get involved and understand and make sure that financial flows go towards the right.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad you took a couple of extra minutes because I forgot to introduce you. Sam Mugume is the co-chair of the Coalition of Finance Ministers, and I think what's critical here is that it is north and south, right? It's 100 countries, and I think explaining from the perspective of the finance ministers like those in our countries who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis to counterparts who also understand trade-offs, but also hold the purse and hold the say on how resources are allocated in some instances is critical. With that, and I'm glad that you talked about this very specific road example. I'm sorry that, again, it's a little off script, but this is important. You are going to talk about roads that have to be upgraded, but in many instances, we're talking about roads that just didn't exist. So this is new infrastructure, this is new capital, and that is the advantage that many of the so-called least developed and less developed countries have, is that these are new pathways that have to be charted. So how do you make them resilient? And if I could turn to Mahmoud Mokhluddin, who is known to everyone as, held the position of the executive director of the IMF for many countries, but also sits on many commissions related to debt. I don't think there's any disagreement between ourselves on this one point, which is that you will need more debt, and that we have to start to reframe how much debt is acceptable and how debt sustainability is not just analyzed in terms of returns, but the volume of debt that countries are going to need to take is digested as acceptable or not acceptable. If you look at the investments that Uganda or Barbados or Egypt has to make, it is going to require increases in debt and debt at affordable terms. How do you shift the mindset of the institutions that you know so well to appreciate that the volume of debt is not necessarily going to go down, but the terms have to improve?
Right. Thank you so much. And let me first congratulate the team for an excellent report. I hope that what we are seeing in reality and practice is matching the good returns promised in the study. And if such good returns are there, one would wonder why they are not happening at scale in the countries that we are monitoring and reviewing closely, especially in the African continent, in the Middle East, and the Mediterranean countries, with updates that we have seen, especially from the private sector share of total investment when it comes to adaptation. There could be some good news in the making, but since the close monitoring happened on investments by the private sector, we have seen a decline, not necessarily an increase. And when it comes to public investments, I wonder if countries that I'm more familiar with their budget than others are spending more than 70% of debt service, and none of the new loans are directed to anything but paying back all debts. So the money exactly would be coming from. And this is actually one of the reasons that joining the Jubilee Commission and the work that we did at the UN, happy to work closely with the rest of the co-chairs, we try to do three things. First, to reflect all of what's being mentioned on the debt sustainability frameworks of the World Bank and the IMF, especially with the current revision of debt sustainability frameworks, with their signals, early warning signals to those who are indebted. And so far, there is nothing of what you have been saying reflected adequately in the debt sustainability analysis. Don't know if the meeting that you had earlier, Pep, is giving us some promises in the revisions of the low-income countries, or in a good day, if we are making some sort of improvements in that framework, that will be reflected in the other more sophisticated, demanding countries, the ones with market access. Although that we have been in a meeting as well that called for merger of the two debt sustainability frameworks, because it doesn't make any sense to make this kind of fragmentation. So we do not really have the guidance when it comes to debt sustainability frameworks, and that's why we have been saying factor in all of these issues related to sustainability, including, of course, public investments in resilience in the debt sustainability framework. The other thing, when it comes to if countries are stuck in debt distress and they are seeking debt restructuring, they are not going to be getting any kind of consideration that they have been spending the money better than in consumption. It doesn't really matter if you spend money in long-term investments for sustainability or building good, resilient infrastructure, or even better for education and health. If you are stuck, you are stuck. The common framework doesn't give any kind of consideration to what cause, noble or otherwise, that you put your money in. This is another proposal that we put in the Jubilee report and in the recommendations from the Debt and Development Crisis Group. Will that be listened to in the G20? I didn't get any kind of signal that that is being realized. So that gets me into the other means of doing business, which is basically, and good that Barbados led the way there on the debt swaps, and there have been some good signals that, including from the IMF, that swaps are not a bad thing if they are aligned with the macro framework, and they are not bad as well if they could be scaled up, not in a piecemeal. And I think what we need now is basically operationalization of some of the recommendations that came out from Seville, including establishment of that hub for swaps and providing the technical assistance and knowledge support for that. This could be one of the areas of focus for the Borrowers Club with the Borrowers Forum to share knowledge, technical assistance as well for those who are involved in swaps for the first time, and hopefully as well by getting better credits into debt swaps for nature and for resilience at large. The stigma associated with swaps will be removed, as we have seen from some of the recent transactions. Ben, you gave me a signal of 1 minute like 2 minutes ago, so let me wrap it up. Especially to welcome as well the Baroness, and we're happy to see her again with her excellent team. So 3 things that can get us hope as well based on the reports. 1, perhaps we can have better understanding of the value of nature and how to protect it, and the value of resilience from the bigger project on the beyond GDP. And I know that Annie in previous life and others have been working on this issue of the natural capital accounting. Now it's happening. Now it's going to be part of the future. So values and price tag could be really useful there. The second one, in a previous discussion, we had some good and serious attention to the value of insurance, and that was mentioned as well in the report, and to the pre-arranged finance, as we discussed before. This is the second area of work, and I'm happy that Brazil is taking the lead on that as well. And the very final thing, the TFFF, and this could be really getting us something at scale when you are really seeing the machinery of markets with good partnership between public finance and the local communities to be benefiting, and good endowments to be, I would say, sacrificed but invested. In addition, not just from Brazil, but other partners are being getting good news on that. That could really be scaling up the work, and if it is going to be successful for the forest, for the Amazonia, the same mechanism could be repeated in other areas of work, and perhaps what Stefan and Nick could be in difference with that could be conversion the practice when we see the project that could answer the 2 areas of concern. So there could be some good news down the road.
No, thank you. And look, we're overwhelmingly optimistic. Some of us may be perhaps overly optimistic, but thank you for those points, and I think they're extremely specific. I realize that we're going to go over time a little bit, but hopefully you'll find that our panelists and our roundtable discussants actually have some really useful things to say. So please bear with us for a few extra minutes, if we may. Welcome, Baroness Chapman. Sorry, we might be just a little bit late. So just 3 more colleagues from the roundtable, if I may. So Karsten Stenvad, who is the President and Chief Investment Officer of the Acumen Fund. If I could turn to you, from your perspective, given what was mentioned earlier, I think, by Annie, which is fair, right? Which is that we're not going to be able to crowd everyone in to solve problems. And if you look at the amount of money that's being spent, for instance, from philanthropy and specific areas, it really is a drop in the ocean. What does a fund like Acumen bring to the table, and how do we see more such successes in ways that perhaps Acumen is known to many, many people, but is perhaps not there's opportunities, I think, to see more of your model replicated elsewhere. What do you think could be brought to the table?
First of all, thank you so much for having us here. I think I can maybe bring the investor angle and maybe a microeconomic angle to this discussion. As you said, Acumen, is a non-profit investor, blending various types of capital, philanthropic capital, concessional capital, and also development finance capital, and even commercial capital. And specifically on agriculture, we've been investing in really the agricultural value chain since 2006, and more than 50 companies in 13 markets, really in frontier markets, especially in Africa, all with the objective of increasing resilience and improving livelihoods of smallholder farmers. So we don't invest in the smallholder farmers, but we invest in businesses that either have smallholder farmers as suppliers or customers, and trying to think about how can we make resilience really investable. And I would say it's true that Acumen, it's a small drop in the ocean, but ultimately, I think what we try to do is to show that it's possible to make it an investable class. And I thought maybe I could share a couple of just some stats with you, because when we look at the companies we've invested in,
we've surveyed both the companies we invest in, but also the beneficiaries, the smallholder farmers. And we've done this consistently over 5-6 years, and we can see what they say, and we can in a way see the themes of today, how they play out at the very micro level. First of all, if you just look at the actual the smallholder farmers that are in our ecosystem, all of them, I think 68% of them talked about experiencing direct impact of whether it's drought, floods, I mean, all the things we've talked about. It is just so pervasive. I was in Pakistan last week. That's all the farmers we met with. That's all they talked about. It's not a theoretical thing. It's so real. And most of these farmers live below the poverty line and have no emergency funds. So in a way, for me, for us, the first maybe obvious point, actually you have it on the slide up here, which is that climate resilience really is about economic resilience. And what can we do in these investments to basically make sure that we actually improve, reduce volatility, of course, increase earnings, because ultimately those things, if we do that for smallholder farmers, they will be much better positioned to absorb the shocks that are definitely coming. And when we look at the beneficiaries, we saw that. The next question, in a way, to crowd in other capital, we want to be able to demonstrate to other investors that this is actually an investable class. So it's relevant to look at, well, what happened with the companies that we invested in? And just a couple of stats, again, this is all in the agricultural value chain. So it could be anything from, a chicken company developing new breeds that thrive in hotter and drier air, or various types of technical assistance to farmers to improve yields. And the companies, when we look at it, there's a great business case. We saw revenue growth of 2.6x. That's great. We saw follow-on funding. I mean, very few are willing to come in to begin with. But one of the things that we think about in terms of the theory of change is if we can go in, we can demonstrate it's good, we can bring other capital along, just from the demonstration effect. And importantly, we just see a significant increase in employment. So this idea of kind of climate resilience really being economic resilience, and ultimately trying to show that this actually is an asset class. So from our perspective, we're committed to investing $300 million over the next couple of years, really in agricultural adaptation and resilience. And I think what I'm so excited about in this conversation and leading up to the COP is the more we can establish this as a first order priority, not just for the world, but actually for investors, and we can show that it is an investable asset class, I think that would be good. I'll just conclude by saying I spent most of my life or career in the traditional finance world, and I think the reality is that no one really looked seriously at this business case. And I hope now is the time that we can, with all of our contributions, can really demonstrate that actually this is an investable asset class.
Thank you for saying that, because I have a colleague in the room who told me when I said this resilience is an asset class. I'm not sure that's possible. So maybe we can have a conversation on how we make that at least substantiate the case, but also how you take the models that Acumen is showing as successful and truly replicate them. Because I think there's often a challenge with identifying the models, and reinventing the wheel is perhaps not the best use of time. So with that, perhaps I could turn to Sanyade Okoli, who is the special advisor to the Nigerian president on finance and the economy. We often talk about the challenges of small countries and equally the challenges of large countries. Like if you can't fix it in a small country, how are you going to do it in Nigeria and Indonesia, wherever, right? But by the same token, a country like Nigeria is considered extremely attractive because that's where many investors want to go. So Nigeria has recently announced or launched the climate investment platform to mobilize 500 million, which I would argue is also a drop in the ocean for a country as large as yours in climate finance for resilience and adaptation projects. Could you tell us a little bit about how that's going and the type of interest you've had? And if I could add to that, how much interest has there been from domestic capital markets?
Okay. It's still quite early stages in terms of the fund. The focus of the fund is threefold. But before I talk about that, there's the question of why are we doing this? Because it's part of what we've been saying, that recognition that you're not going to get social resilience or fiscal resilience or economic resilience without climate resilience. In practical terms, one example of how it's affecting us, and I'll use your agribusinesses, inflation, we've just been celebrating yesterday, inflation coming down from 20% to 18%. Earlier last year, it was about 34%. And food inflation is one of the big drivers of that. So unless we can bring down, part of that relates to the challenges that we're having. So both from a fiscal standpoint and from an economic standpoint, we have to address some of these issues because it is very, very real for us. It's early stages, 3 aspects to the fund. One for climate resilient infrastructure. Lagos, the commercial capital, I think it was a month or 2 ago, we had heavy rainfall. And the city grinds to a halt. It's a city of over 20 million people. And imagine the financial loss that comes from that. Then there's the clean energy transition. Of course, everybody knows about the M300. But again, in terms of building the accessibility and ensuring that as we're doing so, we are doing it in a climate-friendly fashion, because in Nigeria, with the grid not supplying anywhere close to what we require, using diesel generators and petrol generators are very real for us. And the third is the nature-based and adaptation solutions. And for the fund, we've got both the Ministry of Finance Incorporated and also the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority being quite key to this fund to be able to raise the necessary funding. But where are we from a domestic standpoint? The truth is, even as I sat here, I realized that as much as we're slowly beginning to appreciate how real climate change is for us in Nigeria, there's still a significant mindset change that needs to happen. I think that we still see it as one other vertical, another pillar of things to do, as opposed to a horizontal that needs to really cut across everything we do, not just in government, but also in the private sector. And so I leave here feeling quite challenged. The figure that was put up there, I think $1 goes to climate versus, is it close to 90 or something? That sobered me, and it made me think, as somebody who sits in the Ministry of Finance, as we're spending money, we're trying to prioritize how much what we're spending with the tight fiscal space. Are we investing it in things that not just the short term, but the mid to long term will, even if not bearing returns as we see it, is reducing the spend that we will have to make, in 5 or 10 years from now. So I go back ready to be more of a champion for the climate cause. I'll pause here.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for providing that perspective. I think what's interesting, and I won't do this as a follow-up question, but what's interesting for us from the Bridgetown Initiative perspective is to see how much domestic capital can actually be raised for these issues, right? There is a wealth, literally trillions of dollars sitting in emerging markets and developing economies, and we need to find ways to crowd that in and to exercise way more agency over the solutions, not just in terms of the business model, but also the funding of those business models and the returns to keep them domestically, if we can. Welcome, Baroness Chapman. We've gone a little bit over time, but I would be delighted if you could kindly give us your special remarks, and then we will close the session if folks could just give us a few more minutes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for allowing me to say a few words, and for all of you for being here. I'm so sorry I'm late. I was at a health event, and then the traffic, it was like being in London for a bit. But we got here in the end, so thank you. And I'm sure I'll speak to people who were here and find out what was said before I got here as well. But it's the leadership that I'm sure we've heard about in this room this afternoon that is changing what's possible. And she's not here any longer, but I think the inspirational advocacy of Prime Minister Motley is hugely significant. And what I've heard her, what she said to me directly in the past, is that we've got to face up to reality, and the status quo just isn't cutting it. And I'm sure she said kind of words to that effect and more this afternoon. So this is all about championing urgent and ambitious reform, so that we have a global financial system that's fit for the future, that unlocks growth and access to financing for countries, and makes sure, I think importantly, that everybody's voice is heard in this. We need to hear our partners, listen when they say how much they want to work with us as investors, and they're calling on us to bring innovation, expertise, and all our shared strengths to the table, and that's how we are going to back their plans and priorities for the future to give us all the best chance for success. And in visits that I've had recently to Jamaica, Grenada, Barbados, Dominican Republic, I don't only go to the Caribbean, but this is like a list of complete Caribbean, Antigua and the Bahamas. It's been a good year. And in all my meetings, I hear loud and clear that this is what partners want to see. So for our part as the UK, that's very much going to underpin our approach. It's great to see the new Systemiq report helping us to think about how we can unlock opportunity by building resilience to shocks. And just in the short time that I'll take, I've just got 3 very quick reflections. One is that we need everyone to see resilience not just as an upfront cost, but as we have heard, as an opportunity. It's a catalyst for investment that can enable fiscal stability, creditworthiness, competitiveness, and power jobs and growth, and a chance to avoid GDP losses, which would reach up to 33% by mid-century. Vivid examples like those in the report can help us make the case. Like Nestle's climate smart sourcing is driving coffee yields up by as much as 50%, boosting incomes, empowering growers, and securing food systems. In Brazil, $2 billion spent on climate-proofing roads would prevent an estimated $47 billion in losses. By 2030, we're looking at a global market for adaptation and resilience worth between $500 billion and $1.3 trillion. It's extraordinary, and we need to recognise it and say so. Second thing I want to say is that we need everyone to understand the benefits of playing in the private sector. Not only can every dollar invested pay for itself 10 times over in returns, embedding resilience from the get-go is a smart, low-cost way to secure long-term returns, especially since 75% of the infrastructure needed in emerging markets by 2050 hasn't yet been built. And insurance sector innovation is at the heart of making progress on pricing this risk accurately, getting capital into solutions, building confidence, and helping governments prepare for disaster. And 3, we need to work together just to put this into practice. So my focus is on harnessing what the UK has to share. We've got the Met Office, Centre for Disaster Protection, providing advice worldwide. Building on the leadership of countries like Barbados and Grenada, who championed climate resilient debt clauses, allowing them to phase debt repayments after a natural disaster and to invest in recovery instead. As the first bilateral creditor to offer these clauses, we're supporting small states to take up CRDCs in their World Bank loans by covering their fees, and calling on all official creditors to offer these pause clauses as well. We're harnessing the power of the world's #1 green finance hub in the City of London, pioneering much needed solutions. We're working with our Treasury to co-convene an industry-led task force to get private finance flowing into emerging and developing markets, helping to build pipelines of bankable, resilient projects through platforms like the Private Infrastructure Development Group, working alongside the Bridgetown Initiative on efforts to scale up pre-arranged disaster risk financing as a share of crisis finance from, it's just 2% at the moment, we want to get it to 20%. By agreeing this finance before a disaster, we make sure the money reaches those who need it far, far quicker. Developing regional schemes, now underwriting billions of dollars of risk across Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and calling for the multilateral development banks to lead with bold, ambitious climate strategies to reduce emissions and build resilience. To see through the reforms that could build their ability to lend twice as much in the next 10 years. So as today's report sets out really well, resilience is the investment agenda of the 21st century for citizens, communities, companies, for countries. And so all I can say really is that we'll just carry on working closely with you to make the case for action, play in the private sector, and harness all our strengths to build resilience so that we can unlock these benefits of building a safer, more prosperous future for people all around the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances Chapman. So we just have perhaps a minute or so
Very
of closing remarks from Jen Austin, the
Chopping
Director
them
of
down.
Strategy and Policy at the Climate Champions team.
Thank you so much. I will be very quick. It's an honor to be here and to have heard this conversation. And in listening to the room, it's giving me confidence in how we've organized the action agenda for COP30. So I work for the Climate Champions team. We support the high-level climate champions that are appointed by each host country. So it's Danny Yoshbi from Brazil, Nigar Arpadarai, Dr. Mahmoud was the champion from Egypt, former boss. And the
You had your boss.
that task of the action agenda is to work on the non-negotiation side of COP, which is exactly what all of this work is, on the implementation side, thinking about how to bring whole of society solutions to support the countries in achieving those goals. The way that we've designed the action agenda this year is very much to try to bring a structure that does not recreate the wheel, but that is harnessed and anchored in a mirroring of the outcomes of the global stocktake, which is the ways that countries have agreed in quite a bit of detail around some of what the key solutions are that are needed to move us forward, and to make sure that the action agenda is directly responsive to that. So we've focused very much on bringing in existing initiatives around that structure, not recreating the wheel, so that we can harness the type of work that's happening here. Every person, I was nodding along with what people are saying. It's not around needing many new initiatives. There's so much expertise, knowledge, piloting that's already been done, things that have been figured out, research that has confirmed and reconfirmed what the opportunities are and what the barriers are. And we've got an action agenda for COP this year in Belém, and that we hope provides a structure for the 5 years ahead. It's organized around 6 pillars that are thematic and match the topics of the action agenda. Adaptation, it shows up in all of those. It's around energy, industry and transport, forests, oceans and biodiversity, agriculture and food systems, resilient cities and infrastructure, fostering human and social development, and then cross-cutting enablers like finance and capacity. We've got those 6 pillars. Underneath there are 30 specific key objectives. That sounds like a lot, but as you all know, you need to get specific to get detailed and talk to the right people about what it is that you need to do. And so those are the categories around which we're organizing activation groups, inviting in existing initiatives, and then using a 4-step activation process, which is around coordinating those actors, measuring progress around shared indicators so that we know where we've come, sharing success stories, because there are so many success stories. There's been a lot of optimism in this panel, and these are people paying attention, but there's a lot of people out there who are overwhelmed by this challenge and think that not much is happening, and certainly not enough is happening, but a lot already is. And so showcasing those solutions and helping inspire and inform other people's efforts. And then most importantly, or lastly, having groups get together with clear plans to accelerate solutions. What are the blockers, what are the barriers, and how do we bring folks together around specific action plans? There's a number of action plans that are specific, that contain adaptation and resilience. There's one quite comprehensive one around adaptation finance in particular. I'd imagine many of you are involved already, but I'll leave it there. If you're not connected with the activation groups or the climate action team, please do reach out and be in touch. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing many of you in Belém sharing stories of success already, and then joining those workshops around how to lay out those next steps, helping bring that confidence to folks around what is happening, and then bringing the right people together to move forward. So it's a bit, again, of a tactical description of how it is that we're trying to use the COP moment and the platform that it provides to harness and build and then shine a spotlight on the best of what's already happening, and let it be a bit of a problem-solving space so that we can continue to move forward.
Thank you so much, Jen. And I think that's actually a really good way to end this, which is, you call it tactical, I call it practical. I'm going to do 3 things. One is connect with your activation group. The second is connect with Carsten. And the third is, Terry, we're so overdue for a conversation, but this point around embedding into ministries of finance has me extremely awake. So, no, really, more fired up than usual. And on top of all of that, we're only 7 minutes over time. Thanks for stressing me, Verla. So all of that to say that we got from A to B. It was a little bit loopy, but I think that's the message. Whatever it takes for us to get to Rome or to Lagos or to Bridgetown, can we just find that path? And I'm not saying that in any sort of pretentious way. I'm conferenced out, I'm paneled out, and I'm sure many of you are as well. But I do think, sincerely, this is the type of conversation that gives me a little bit more energy to continue the fight, and hopefully to you also. Thank you for being here.
I don't know if I will survive.
Glad to see it.